Hello and welcome back to the Poetics of. This is a series where we're taking a look at different poetic techniques and stylistic choices that can be found in other pieces of media that aren't necessarily explicitly being presented as poetry. So, although I was tempted to do another, Hololive song, I figured it would be important to diversify my portfolio a bit. So I wanted to take a look at one of my favorite songs from one of my favorite bands, which is A Pair of Brown Eyes by the Pogues. Yeah, so as you can tell from this introduction, this is a pretty niche series, but it's a lot of fun. So I'm super stoked if you want to join me on this endeavor into diving deeper into the poetics of this song. And yeah, get yourself a coffee or, some popcorn and a good drink. And I hope this is just sort of a fun, chill way to unwind after a long day and learn a bit more about poetry along the way. So with that, I think we should just jump right into the first section. All right, so I made things a little bit darker on the screen, so I hope that helps your eyes. It doesn't make it so much like you're being flashbanged. So with this piece, the first verse is actually pretty long, so I thought it would be advantageous to break it up a bit into smaller chunks. So it's a bit more digestible and we have a bit more space on the screen for our annotations. So one of the things I wanted to first jump into, because it's one of the reasons I picked this song, is its use of meter is really good for sort of training the ear to getting used to the sort of stressed, unstressed relationship we have with the English language. So basically in poetry, there's different forms of poetic form. So for example, you have the sonnet, the lyric, an ode, for example. And one of the defining features of many of those poetic forms is its meter. So for example, sonnets are divided, it's 14 lines, it's divided into a rhyme scheme, but each line follows a set meter, and that is iambic pentameter. So I'll write that there. And what that basically means is that you're going to have a series of unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, and so forth 5 times. So there's, 5 groupings of these. And when I first started getting into poetry, I will fully admit I had a really hard time with this concept. For some reason, my ear just couldn't hear and pick out the unstressed, stressed. And sometimes I still feel like I get them wrong. And sometimes I think it's also kind of a subjective choice. And it also sort of depends on what words are around that beat. So, for example, sometimes I feel like and can either be stressed or unstressed depending on the context. But in English class, I would always have it where the teacher would point to a poem and say, what meter is this? And people would immediately be able to identify it as unstressed, stressed. And one of the songs I found that really helped me kind of get a better ear for this is A Pair of Brown Eyes. I feel like when you're actually listening to the song, you can really hear the sort of up-down motion that you get with this sort of meter. That being said, I meant to mention this earlier, I'm not saying this song follows iambic pentameter. If anything, it's pretty close to a ballad form. And so the ballad form still uses these iambs, which is what you would call each of these sections, but it follows a different count. So the ballad form has one line will have 4, and then the next line will have 3. And so you see this in a lot of traditional, truly traditional old folk ballads. So, because it basically has the rhythm then of ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. So it's sort of that da 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 da, and it goes so forth. And you kind of hear that it's not exact here. He kind of plays around with the meter and it doesn't always follow that, but you start to kind of hear that sort of ballad-esque meter going on, where one line is sometimes longer than the following line. So let's just take a quick look at this section and sort of try to identify some of those stressed and unstressed. So we sort of have a one summer evening drunk to hell, I stood there nearly lifeless. An old man in the corner sang, where the water lilies grow. And on the jukebox Johnny sang about a thing called love. And it's how are you, kid, and what's your name, and how would you bloody know? I'm not gonna lie, the ending's a bit rough, because again, I feel like it sometimes gets a bit subjective, because you could also say it's how are you, kid, and what's your name, or and it's how are you, kid, and what's your name. So again, sort of just wanted to make this as sort of an anecdote. I ended up going about this a little bit too long, but I feel like when you actually listen to the song, you'll have a better chance of hearing it rather than my little presentation here. But regardless, it's sort of a fun thing that you don't always see with songs, especially such a sort of exaggerated sound of those beats, because you just don't normally hear it being presented quite that distinctly. If you don't know what I'm talking about, check out the song and then you'll see, I get what he's saying. So let's jump into the other parts of this section. All right, so the first verse is actually quite long, so I thought it would be advantageous to break it up into smaller chunks, and I've also gone ahead and made the screen a bit darker. I hope it's a bit easier on your eyes that way. So the first main thing that I want to sort of discuss with this song is its meter, because that's actually one of the main reasons why I selected this song. So for those of you who might be unfamiliar, in poetry, meter is one of the more important aspects that creates its sort of musical style, and it's also used to help sort of categorize it and help define it and or help it mold towards a certain form. So, for example, we have sonnets and limericks and odes and all sorts of different poetic forms. And some of those poetic forms simply rely on the syllables per line, but other ones, like the sonnet, rely on the actual meter and the beats of each line. So in a sonnet, we get iambic pentameter, which is one of the more common meters you'll find in English poetry. Iambic pentameter. And so what that means is that you'll have a line of 5 beats of unstressed and then stressed. So those are called iambs. So when we're trying to identify them and annotate a piece of poetry, we usually draw it as something like this. So here you can see there's 5 sets. And basically what's going on with that is you get an unstressed and then you get a stressed. Because in the English language, we tend to stress different syllables or beats and sounds in the words. So if you look at any Shakespeare sonnet, for example, they almost always follow pretty rigidly this meter. But whenever that meter is broken, it's usually pretty interesting and worth looking more into why they might be trying to draw your attention to that set part of the poem. There's also, however, the ballad form, which I would argue this song is a bit closer to. So the ballad form follows it where it has a line of 4 iambs, then 3, then 4, and then 3 again. So, if you'll pardon my sort of singy-songy, demonstration of this, basically it creates sort of a musical sound that you see in a lot of like truly traditional folk ballads. This isn't so much like 80s pop ballads, but it's more like folk ballads, like think like medieval ballads. So it kind of has the musicality of ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. So as you can see, it creates sort of like a bouncy sort of effect, which is different than iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter people usually compare sort of to being like the beats that's supposed to be a heart, the beating of the human heart. It's sort of like a consistent and steady beat that, you know, it doesn't break up. In a poem that's in iambic pentameter, the next line would also be in iambic pentameter and so forth, while in a ballad there's sort of a variation. Sometimes ballads though will also just do 4 4 4 4 4, etc. One of my favorite examples of this is John Keats's La Belle Dame sans Merci. It's a really good ballad, and just an interesting poem in general, so definitely would recommend checking that one out. But anyway, back to A Pair of Brown Eyes. So the reason I'm bringing this all up is when I first started taking English courses, especially in college, I had a really hard time with meter and iambic pentameter, etc. I don't know what it is. My ear just really struggles to actually discern sometimes those beats. And I would always be confused when, you know, the professor would point to a passage and basically say to the whole class, okay, what meter is this in? And the whole class could say in unison it, and I would have absolutely no idea. So, but when I heard this song by the Pogues, it sort of clicked. And, you know, I'll fully admit that sometimes I still struggle with meter, and I'll also argue that sometimes I think meter is a bit more subjective than people will, you know, lead on, in that a lot of the times it also has to do with the context. For example, a one-syllable word like and can sometimes be a stressed beat, or it can be unstressed, depending on sort of the larger context of the line. But anyway, when you hear this song, if you haven't heard this song before, I would recommend checking it out, because the actual performance really falls into that sort of ballad-esque sound where it's very bouncy and it's very up and down and up and down and up and down. And it's a very satisfying song to listen to in that way, but it also kind of helps train your ear a bit. So I'm going to take a quick look at this passage and sort of point that out, and then probably won't be looking at the meter that much else in this video. But you sort of get, one summer evening, drunk to hell, I stood there nearly lifeless. An old man in the corner sang, where the water lilies grow. So just from that passage alone, you can kind of start to see what I'm talking about. But all of that now aside, let's just jump right into this passage and look at it a bit more closely. So right from the beginning, we can see that there is a bit of a rhyme scheme here, but it's not necessarily as locked in as you might find in a poem. So get my pen to be a bit more of a normal size. So we have sang and sang, know and grow, but hell and lifeless don't rhyme, and love, lifeless, hell, and name don't rhyme. So we sort of get an A, B, C, C, D, D, E, F sort of rhyme scheme there. But let's also now try to take a look at what this opening portion is trying to tell us, because, you know, this is where we're going to learn who our speaker is, what their attitudes are, what the setting is, the environment, what's sort of going on. So we get that it's a summer evening, and we get that our speaker is drunk to hell. So I feel like with that sort of drunkenness, we're already jumped into a perspective that feels a little bit like it might be sort of a blackout drunk, in that it's a bit more fragmented as it sort of drops us right into the scene. We don't get the context of going up to the bar, getting a drink, slowly getting more drunk, etc. It's like it begins where you're already so drunk that you're basically incoherent. And then says, I stood there nearly lifeless, which is already bringing up some interesting words here that we'll get to later. But hell and lifeless already have a pretty negative connotation. An old man in the corner sang, where the water lilies grow. And on the jukebox, Johnny sang about a thing called love. So these appear to be songs, so it's less lines and more almost lyrics / theme songs within the context of the poem. And it's how are you, kid, and what's your name, and how would you bloody know? So what's interesting here is it feels like already we're getting a different speaker sort of jumps in, and again with that sort of drunken blackoutness, it's presented immediately where it's not then an older man approached me and then asked me how are you, kid, and what's your name. And it really sort of also fits that sort of atmosphere of being at a drunken bar or a pub or something where you can picture, it's actually a quite cinematic scene where you can sort of picture someone is standing up against a bar, the actual physical bar within a bar, and he's having his drink, he's sort of swaying, he can hear people in the distance with a jukebox, he can hear someone singing, and then some other character comes up next to him, and he also appears to be a bit drunk by his sort of the abruptness of his dialogue almost has a certain drunken slurriness to it, and he comes up immediately and he's like, oh, how are you, kid, and what's your name? So we already know that they're not familiar with each other, so they're strangers. And how would you bloody know? That part is a bit more vague, but it seems like he's already sort of upset by something. And as we often see with sort of like a drunken state, sometimes people are confrontational in a way that doesn't always make sense. So we're seeing that. But as we've done in different videos, I always like to take a quick look at the last word of every line, because it's sort of a fun exercise you can do with poetry where you can look at the last words and you can sort of get like a significant amount of the actual meaning of the passage without any other context. So we get hell, lifeless, sang, grow, sang, love, name, and know. So hell and lifeless, are very negative. They have negative connotations, and they bring about the idea of death. Lifeless is death, and hell is a place you go to after you've died. But then we get singing about love, and also introductions, name and knowing. They sort of conjure a sense of introductions, which also plays into the fact that they are strangers. Where the water lilies grow, there's not much to garner from just the word grow as the context of here, but love is also sort of interesting because here we seem to get a bunch of characters who are alone, and they're also all male characters. So we have Johnny, who is not actually at the bar, but is actually a singer on the jukebox. But we have an old man, and we have the main character, who is a man, presumably because the singer of the song and the writer of this, Shane, is, a man. So we have, sort of 3 men / 2 men in this bar on a summer evening, and, they are alone. And we also get that from the time, in that since it's a summer evening, it feels like, playing into sort of tropes. Since it's a poem, since it's, a piece of writing, we can play into tropes a bit more than we would with something that's autobiographical, for example. Summer evening is sort of a context where you would imagine you would be with your girlfriend or wife if you had one. So the fact that they are all at this bar on a summer evening kind of tells us that they might be alone. And then we get more context of that by the fact that they're listening to songs, about a thing called love, and, they're just getting super drunk, which implies a certain amount of escapism too, because the drunkenness here doesn't necessarily seem fun. It's not a, roaring 20s celebration. It's, drunk to hell. It's lifeless. It's, which makes it seem like it's negative, which makes it seem like maybe it is, drinking as a form of escapism. And we also can tell that the other gentleman who comes up to our main character here is an older gentleman, because he calls him kid, which obviously does not mean he thinks it's his kid. It's just, something older people call younger people. And it's a bit condescending. It's a bit aggressive, and we'll see if that plays out later in the song, if they get along or not. If this is going to be like a good conversation or not. And again, there's already this sort of confrontation. It's not clear if this old man in the corner who's singing is the same old man who then comes up and starts talking to him. But yeah, I think that serves as a good jumping in point. So let's jump to the next section. All right. And so in this next section, we get a bit more context as to what's really going on in this poem. So this is the line we left off on, and then it goes on. In blood and death, 'neath a screaming sky, I lay down on the ground, and the arms and legs of other men were scattered all around. Some cursed, some prayed, then cursed, then prayed and bled some more. And the only thing that I could see was a pair of brown eyes that was looking at me. But when we got back, labeled parts 1 to 3, there was no pair of brown eyes waiting for me. So here, the older gentleman who approaches our, main character begins to detail a, really visceral war experience. And, the actual concept of this war experience of getting effectively blown apart by enemy gunfire reminds me a lot of another song that I believe is an Australian song, but is sung by a lot of Irish singers, and I believe even the Pogues have done it, which is Waltzing Matilda. And in that song, if I remember correctly, the main gist is that, before all these soldiers left for war, they were playing this song called Waltzing Matilda, and they were dancing, and, they thought they were going to leave and just become war heroes and be home soon. But obviously the reality of war is very different than that. So the main narrator of that song states that, they lose their legs in the war, and they come back, and the band is still playing Waltzing Matilda, but they can't dance anymore, and there's such a bitterness to that, and yearning to go back in time to before the war, but mostly just sort of like a disillusioned bitterness. And here it appears that the individual who has approached our main speaker had a very similar experience. So, a screaming sky, that immediately brings to mind artillery fire. They laid down on the ground, and the arms and legs of other men were scattered all around. So clearly, their allies are, for the sake of YouTube, we'll just say they were hurt. And as they were wounded, it was this experience where some were cursing and some were praying. Some prayed, then cursed, then prayed, and bled some more. And so this can best be, sort of summarized as, the great disillusionment, where within the context of this horrifying scene, the people experiencing it sort of, some immediately start out having lost their faith or never had faith. Some have faith, and they prayed and prayed and prayed, and then no solace came, so then they began to curse, but then they fell back on it, but then ultimately they bled some more. And throughout this entire experience, this other speaker, this other character, the only thing that they could see was a pair of brown eyes that was looking at me. And this is sort of an interesting line. So, as we talked about a bit in our last episode, looking at the Cecilia song, sometimes with poetry, or in this case with song lyrics, there's a certain level of ambiguity. And I've always sort of had a soft spot for ambiguity when it's done well like this, because I think it's that ambiguity that keeps you coming back to the piece over and over again, trying to find better understanding, a better sense of understanding and meaning out of it. But ultimately, because of the nature of ambiguity like that, you're never going to necessarily get that. So, for example, here one could possibly interpret that the pair of brown eyes that was looking at them was another wounded soldier, dead soldier, who was looking at him, and he's looking at these brown eyes. But I think a more accurate interpretation is probably that in that moment, what he was thinking about was a romantic interest back home. So, his mind turns to home, love, a romantic interest. It's a sentiment we see a lot in war stories. I don't want to comment on real war or anything like that, but in a lot of war stories, when people are wounded or in dire circumstances, we see them often cry out for their mother, or in this case they think about their wives or romantic interest. I think when I hear this whole passage, my mind also immediately goes to The Things They Carried, which is a Vietnam War story book. And one of the main scenes that comes to mind is this guy has this stone that his girlfriend back home mailed to him, and he sort of becomes obsessed with this stone and the idea of that girlfriend. And then one day his girlfriend writes to him, breaking up with him, and it sort of details how that type of devastation can impact someone in a war setting, especially when the idea of that other person is often what gets them through it. And it's often depicted as being more of an idea rather than necessarily the real thing. For example, we also see that in The Great Gatsby, where Gatsby goes off to war and becomes all the more obsessed with Daisy. And Then when he comes back home from the war, she's already married. And so here, this protagonist, or the speaker, not the protagonist, is saying that they were in this war experience, and all that they could see in that moment was a pair of brown eyes that was looking at me. But when we got back, labeled parts 1 to 3, there was no pair of brown eyes waiting for me. So this labeled parts 1 to 3 is sort of a figurative speech to show that they were, broken, wounded, and, basically dismembered. But when they get back, there was no pair of brown eyes waiting for them. So this romantic interest, whoever this person is, whether they actually were in a relationship or not, they were not there anymore. And this sort of sentiment and this moment is haunting this second character. And, because again, going back to the opening image, it's a bunch of men drunk at a bar. They're alone. They don't have significant others with them. And they're all, they're in hell, and they're so drunk it's like they're lifeless. And it seems like, the sort of PTSD from this moment goes back to the whole "and how would you bloody know?" and that sort of confrontational sort of like resentment. And to just look a bit at the other poetic techniques for this close reading, we have rhyme of around and ground. We have see, me, 3, me. But then we have, for example, we have no, sky, men, cursed, and more, which don't really rhyme with anything. And also, as we pointed out earlier, it still also has a lot of that sort of in blood and death, neath a screaming sky, I lay down on the ground. Some cursed, some prayed, then cursed, then prayed and bled some more. You could also argue maybe some is stress there, but you see what I get a bit maybe about that sort of subjectiveness. But what's also interesting about this whole passage that I want to sort of talk about, so let's see if I can, erase all that so it's a bit easier to see, is that you have some interesting tense stuff coming on, showing up in this, and some interesting things with POV and sort of like the way dialogue is being presented. So it's, how would you bloody know? But then jumps immediately into this passage. So it's not, oh, and how would you bloody know? Did you know 40 years ago I was in a scenario? It's not fully presented as being in the past, because we also get sort of I lay down on the ground, and the arms and legs of other men were scattered all around. Some cursed, some prayed, then cursed, then prayed and bled some more. And the only thing I could see was a pair of brown eyes that was looking at me. But when we got back, labeled parts 1 to 3, there was no pair of brown eyes waiting for me. And so it's sort of this interesting sort of dynamic where this person starts off at a bar, and then just immediately it just sort of jump cuts to the convo. And in truth, it sort of jump cuts to the bar in the beginning, where it just starts off drunk. Then we get a quick look around the bar. Then suddenly we're having a conversation. And then suddenly we get a jump cut to the war. And in that, we get sort of a slowly transitions to past tense. But the fact that it starts in a present tense, where it's in blood and death, 'neath a screaming sky, I lay down on the ground, that immediately, it shows and reveals that for the second speaker who's talking to our protagonist, this is, he's right back in the moment. And also, part of that sort of PTSD seems to be directly related to this sort of, artillery / just the violence, because there's arms and legs are scattered all around. They're labeled to parts 1 to 3. They're bleeding out. And also, what's sort of interesting about the pair of brown eyes is it's sort of both like personified as, it's the pair of brown eyes is now almost the person, but it's interesting that they're hyper focused on the eyes. It's not, oh, when we got back, this woman was waiting for me or wasn't waiting for me. There seems to be a hyper focus on the eyes. And the fact that those are body parts and the scene is all body, and the PTSD is related to body parts, I think that's pretty interesting. I don't know fully yet how else to interpret that, or why this person might be sort of, obsessed with the eyes, except beyond the fact that it might have really just been the image of the brown eyes that was getting him through the moment. And so basically it further reveals that it might be that sort of Gatsby-esque, it's more the idea of this other woman rather than actually being the other woman, if that makes sense. So yeah, let's jump into the next portion and see what else we can learn. All right, and then we get just a short portion that still warrants mentioning. So here we have, and a rovin', I'll go for a pair of brown eyes. And so this line appears to still be spoken by the, second speaker. But also to talk about that meter thing again, so you can have, and a rovin', I'll go. And this is sort of what I mean about the context thing. I feel like other people could certainly argue that it should actually be, and a rovin', I'll go. With that and, but the way it's performed in the song and how I feel like one would perform it in a reading is to stress it. You'd be like, and a rovin', I'll go. But anyway, I digress. So with the rovin', that's a word we see a lot in Irish music, which is the concept of roving, which we also see in, for example, Lord Byron's so we'll go a rovin' no more, which is sort of a whole thing about how acknowledging that the good old days of young love are gone. So very Byronic. But here, I feel like what's important to mention is that roving basically means wandering. But it's often, you can be defined as sort of just moving from a place to a place. But I really want to emphasize how much it means to wander, which sort of is like, without aim, or at the very least, like without direction. Because here the aim is to find a pair of brown eyes, but they don't know where to find it, so they're going to just keep going and wandering and wandering and wandering all over. They're going to go searching for a pair of brown eyes. And what I will say is that before I started this video and whatnot, I had no intention of drawing a parallel between this and The Great Gatsby, because this is like an Irish folk rock sort of pub song, and Gatsby is a 1920s about the American dream, etc. But at the same time, the American dream and the Irish the Irish narrative go hand in hand so much, because I feel like you can sort of summarize the themes of a lot of Irish music as the Irish people were forced to see their homeland deteriorate more and more until it was no longer hospitable. Then they made the desperate jump to try to go to America in pursuit of the American dream, only to find that the American dream wasn't really real either. And so now they're left in a place that's not their home, feeling homesick and disillusioned with everything. So it is pretty interesting that a big theme here is sort of this endless wandering in pursuit of a past that they can no longer obtain, which is very Gatsby coded. It's the whole boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Gatsby has the green light, and here they have a pair of brown eyes. It basically is the same thing in both, where it's this sort of image that becomes an obsession that sort of means, the meaning of the image is sort of a return to a better past. So, if he can just get that pair of brown eyes, it'll be like before he went off to war. Similar with Gatsby, if he can just reach that green light and obtain Daisy and get, the old love and all of that, he can go back to his life before the war. So, very, very similar themes. And I feel like these pieces are actually like totally in conversation with one another in a way I had never realized until I started doing this analysis. And truly, that is what this series is all about. All right, and so that brings us now to this final verse, which is the last part we'll be taking a close look at. So there's a lot to dissect, so we'll jump right in, and I will start with a quick reading of it. I looked at him, he looked at me, all I could do was hate him, while Ray and Philomena sang of my elusive dream. I saw the streams, the rolling hills, where his brown eyes were waiting, and I thought about a pair of brown eyes that waited once for me. So drunk to hell, I left the place, sometimes crawling, sometimes walking. A hungry sound came across the breeze, so I gave the walls a talking, and I heard the sounds of long ago from the old canal. And the birds were whistling in the trees where the wind was gently laughing. This is a really interesting passage that is again filled with some ambiguity, but also some of that ambiguity / some vagueness feels like it's being used intentionally to sort of reflect the drunken state. So we come back to the bar after that pretty intense war scene, where it says that I, back to the first protagonist, looked at him, he looked at me, all I could do was hate him, while Ray and Philomena sang of my elusive dream. So this is a pretty interesting allusion, which is, when one piece of media references another. Here, he is directly referring to the song My Elusive Dream by Ray and Philomena. And ironically enough, that song is sort of about talking about a couple making it through hard times. While here we have basically two scenarios which sort of allude to the pair of brown eyes being the other person in these relationships, not kind of holding up their end of the bargain of the relationship, and from their perspective, abandoning them when they needed them the most. Now, we don't know, again, how much they actually were in relationships, how much of it was actually just made in their head, and sort of like significance was put on, a chance encounter with the heightenedness of things like war. So basically, we can see that the protagonist hates the second speaker, the older war vet, because his story about abandonment further reflects what the main character is going through. So, by telling him his story about how his pair of brown eyes abandoned him, the main character, who's clearly drinking his woes away, is only forced to further confront his own sort of abandonment / dissolvement of a relationship. What's interesting here is we sort of get some sort of romanticism coming through, which is sort of what we saw in the Romantic period was a emphasis of the importance of nature, and sort of how nature can reflect basically the attitudes of the observer, or can serve as a reflection of some state or time based on their condition. So basically all that's saying is that if someone is trying to write about a past time in their life with a sense of nostalgia, and they're trying to emphasize that those were the good old days, they're always going to describe the nature as being very beautiful. No one is like, oh, I remember how wonderful it was to be a kid when the fields were dry and the crops didn't grow and everything was desolate and terrible. No, instead they're going to be like, oh, I remember laying on the green grass looking up at the blue sky and the huge white clouds, and I remember how I used to see different shapes and animals in those clouds, etc., etc. Also, though, within the context of sort of the Irish background, I mean, this is a Pogue song, it sort of has to do with, as we were saying earlier, with this sort of nostalgia for the past. Also comes from a nostalgia and homesickness for Ireland. And so here we can interpret these descriptions as being descriptions of Ireland, the rolling hills of Ireland, the streams, and it seems to be where his brown eyes were waiting. So if the protagonist can see these streams and rolling hills, it implies that this other speaker is probably from the same location as him. They both have seen it. Which leads me to infer that these may be two Irish immigrants in another place. That could be England, could be America, could be somewhere totally different, but it seems like they are two people who have both seen these streams, because otherwise, how would the protagonist be able to imagine the streams and rolling hills where this war vet had a pair of brown eyes? And similarly, he then proceeds to think about his own pair of brown eyes that waited once for him. So he also seems to have maybe, an Irish woman that he is sort of yearning for in a way, but also feels abandoned by. So there actually is a close connection between these two figures in this song, between the war vet and the protagonist slash speaker narrator. So, and waited once for me. So similarly, once means that, they no longer are. And he's clearly alone, so it seems like he has now been separated from this pair of brown eyes. So drunk to hell, which is, reference back to the beginning of the song, he left the place, leaving the bar, sometimes crawling, sometimes walking. What's sort of interesting about this line is, on the one hand, it sort of just serves to convey how drunk the speaker is. He's so drunk that he's stumbling about, crawling, sometimes, is able to walk. However, it also sort of feels like it's a callback to the earlier war imagery of these, dismembered soldiers who were losing their arms and their legs and, were sent back labeled parts 1 to 3. So here now the protagonist is somewhat mirroring that by crawling and walking. And it, if he's left the bar, he's trying to go home. And similarly, those soldiers were wanting to go home and, they returned home unable to walk. So there's sort of a parallelism there. And then a hungry sound came across the breeze, so I gave the walls a talkin'. Now, that's sort of an interesting line where I'll fully admit, since I'm purposely not doing any sort of research or reading genius annotations, the extent of my research for this was Googling what this song was by Ray and Philomena. I don't fully know what this line means, I'll fully admit, because, when you say you gave the walls a talking, it kind of sounds like he sort of lectured them. Because it's sort of like, oh yeah, my kids were acting up a ton, so I gave them a talk. And, it's like that sort of like a disciplinary lecture. It's sort of, someone kept bumping into me, so I gave them a talking, which is sort of like basically like rather than fist fighting kind of thing. But I'm curious as to what a hungry sound that came across the breeze. I'm kind of curious what that is, because it's not that the breeze is the hungry sound, it just came across the breeze. So basically, on the breeze, he hears a hungry sound. A noise is carried from somewhere else, and as a result of that, he gives the walls a talkin'. I don't know if that's indicative of his own hunger, and he's sort of hearing his own hunger being reflected back on the breeze, and it's an echo, and so he's mad at the walls because the walls are echoing the sound. Truly, I'm going to fully admit here, I don't know specifically what we're supposed to get from this line. And that's going to come up a lot in this series because, again, I'm trying to push myself to do these close readings without having done research, because if I do all that research, then I'm just, regurgitating that information, and it's sort of the antithesis of trying to do a close reading, because, true close reading is just you're given the poem, you're given the, the piece of media that you're supposed to annotate and sort of dissect and see what kind of meaning you can garner for yourself. So here, though, as he gives the walls a talkin', which also, I don't know if that's supposed to mean he then vomited on a wall and it's a euphemism because he's so drunk, or if he's so drunk he's talking to the walls thinking that he's talking to someone else. I just don't know. But he then proceeds to hear the sounds of long ago from the old canal. So what's interesting here is it almost feels like as he's walking through these sort of dirty streets, the Pogues who famously wrote Dirty Old Town, although that's sort of a weird nostalgia for the Dirty Old Town with the gas yard walls and all that. But here, it's actually sort of in a romantic way. It reminds me of a painting that I think is like a cubic painting or cubinism that shows a train rolling over sort of in a countryside, and it's sort of comparing the industrial imagery to the pastoral imagery. Here we have the old canal and the walls of this city landscape that he's walking through as he's leaving the bar. But he actually, is starting to see the streams and the rolling hills, which are very warm and, pleasant. Streams and rolling hills, and then you compare it to being drunk as hell and crawling and walking through and the walls. But then from the old canal, he starts to sort of hear the sounds of long ago, which seem to be almost like the sounds of Ireland, or at least of his homeland. And he suddenly hears birds whistling in the trees, and the wind was gently laughing. And, word choice matters. We always say this with poetry. We've done this with some other episodes, that word choice in the context of something like a poem or a song is so important, because you obviously get way less of a word count than you would have with a novel or a short story. Short stories can be 10,000 words, and a poem you're only going to have several hundred. At most, you could have much less than that. And so here, again, the adverb of gently tells us that it's not a mocking laughter with the wind here, but it's actually a gentle laughing. And, the birds, they're not cawing like ravens, they're not cawing, but instead they're whistling, which sounds just musical. And also, when you whistle, it's sort of in a state of ease. People tend to whistle absent-mindedly. So it's sort of a, it's a relaxed state, which lends itself to that sort of state of, the better days, the past, where there was this image of this older place where there's this pair of brown eyes and there were birds whistling in the trees, the wind would gently laugh, there were streams and rolling hills, and it's, such a stark contrast to this state of drunken hellishness where, the people who talk to you, you just can't help but hate them because you're bitter and you have this resentment and this frustration and this disillusionment. And so it's really interesting seeing sort of this emergence and almost fade into nature, especially that these images and these sounds are actually coming up from the old canal. So there's again this canal in the city, but it's just such an interesting image. I'm almost picturing canal and sort of a sewer tunnel pipe type thing. And it's as you're walking home late at night, you hear distantly, birds whistling in the trees and sort of a gentle wind that almost feels like it's gentle laughter, and it's sort of calling you back home. And it sort of reminds me of there's it's just a silly stupid internet meme, but there's two versions where one, it's that millennials and Gen Z will hear the chirping of a mourning dove, and it suddenly reminds them of being kids in summer. Or there's another one where you're walking and you suddenly smell a sort of fragrance on the breeze, and for just a split moment it takes you back to this moment in childhood, and just as you're starting to remember this sort of forgotten memory of comfort and nostalgia, the smell fades away and it's lost forever, and you're ripped away from that sort of dream and memory. So it's curious to see here where this protagonist is going to go based on this, because like Gatsby, always chasing that green light, is the protagonist now going to go and endlessly pursue this pair of brown eyes? Because what does that pair of brown eyes represent? If the pair of brown eyes had been waiting for them before they left for the war, before, the hardship. Let's actually make it a bit neater, because I feel like this is a big thing to talk about. What do brown eyes represent? Well, again, I think it's very similar to what the green light represents in Gatsby. And I do apologize because I'm basically making this video assuming that you've read The Great Gatsby. I would give like a quick full summary of everything for The Great Gatsby, but I honestly don't want to spoil that book because it's really good. And I think it sometimes gets a bad rep of being sort of like a homework-esque book, but it's genuinely one of my favorite novels. So suffice to say, all I'll say is that there is this green light at the end of a dock in the book, and it seems to symbolize this sort of unobtainable symbol of the past. You can't quite reach out and you can't quite hold that green light in your hand. And similarly, it feels like the brown eyes represent something of the past because they knew of the brown eyes before their hardship. So, the older gentleman at the bar clearly is a war vet. I'm not sure what the protagonist has gone through. Is he also a war vet? Did he fight in a different war? Maybe the older gentleman fought in World War II and this protagonist fought in the Vietnam War, something like that. Or it could be just something totally different scenario. But regardless, it's something they knew before. But when they entered into the after state, after the hardship, after the struggles, they no longer had the brown eyes. So, in that way, it seems as if these people believe that if they can get back to the brown eyes, then they'll be able to get back to the rolling hills and the streams where the birds were whistling in the trees and the wind was gently laughing. It'll be a return to that warm summered past where everything was much better and easier and life made sense, and they had the comfort of a love interest who seemed interested in them at that time and seemed to be waiting for them. And if they could just get back to that, then they'll return to all of this goodness. So let's jump into the last portion of this and see what the protagonist does, having gotten a glimpse of these brown eyes, having almost been reminded of the brown eyes. And so the answer to that question is that this protagonist now continues on to rove and rove, and rove I go, and I rove and a rovin' and a rovin' I'll go, for a pair of brown eyes, for a pair of brown eyes, and then it repeats again. And so here we see that this character ultimately chooses maybe it's his destiny to forever wander in search of that nicer past. And so I think that basically concludes this close reading. I know I just said I didn't want to fully spoil The Great Gatsby for anyone, but I'm about to transition and I'm going to do a quick reading of just the last paragraph of The Great Gatsby so as to compare it to the ending of this song. So there's your little spoiler warning coming up. But yeah, I guess then I'll do a quick wrap up here in case you don't want to capture that, catch that spoiler. Just wanted to thank you for tuning in this long, for sticking around with this. Again, I know these are very niche, but I have a lot of fun making these, and I hope that you guys have fun joining me for this. I hope that we can kind of grow as poets together as we look at different pieces of media, and also sort of find more appreciation for the sort of art of doing a close reading, because like I said, I had no intention of drawing a Gatsby comparison, but sort of the magic of this process is that you discover things as you go. So with that, I'll jump into The Great Gatsby, and if you're tuning off here, thank you again. And so that final passage of The Great Gatsby goes, Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past.